Chapter 2 The Literature at the End of the Empire Demonstrations for Peace. Come, crows, come numberless, you will all be satiated. Louise Michel, Songs of 78. The resentments, piled up, fermenting in silence for 20 years, were rumbling everywhere. Thoughts was unleashed. Books, which ordinarily entered France only secretly, were starting to be edited in Paris. The empire, terrified, put on a mask, labeling itself as liberal, but no one believed it, and every time they mentioned 1789, we thought 1852. L'échéance de 69, the deadline of 69, by Rogeart, summed up as early as 66 the general sentiment. The destitution of 69, he said, is a fatidic date. There is a single united voice for the fall of the empire in 69. We await liberty as millennials awaited the return of the Messiah. We knew it as the astronomer knows the laws of eclipses. One only need to take out a watch and observe the phenomenon passing while counting the minutes which still separate France from the light. The underlying causes, said Rogeart in the same book, are in constant opposition and irreconcilable between the tendencies of the governing and those of society, the permanent violation of the governed's interests, the contradiction between the say and the do of those who govern, the ostentation of the principles of 89 with the applications of those of 52, the necessity of those governing, for those governing, of war, and mostly war of conquest, vital principle of a military monarchy. Despite the unpopularity of wars of conquest, annexation, of pillage and invasion, in a century of workers schooled and a little bit more reasonable than its elders. The necessity of a political police and of a political judicial authority in a country where the government is in struggle with the nation, necessity which dishonors the judicial authorities and the police, consoles the ne'er-do-wells, and discourages honest people. Rogeart, deadline of 69, 1866. Rogeart adds in the same books, there is an immense expansion of popular sentiment, simultaneously a resurgence of imperial repression. Nevertheless, if the compression increases on one side, while the expansion increases from the other, it is clear that the machine will blow up. I see like you the agony, and I do not wish to wait. The opinion is rising. It is true, rapidly, irresistibly. I agree. But why tell the flow you will go no faster? The empire is dying. The empire is dead. Yet he clings on. We must finish it, and not listen to it wail. We must not check its pulse, but ring its last charge. Rogeart, same book. Antonin Dubost, since Keeper of the Seals, Minister of Justice of the Third Republic, Rapporteur of the Loi Scélérate, Law of the Villains, wrote in his book The Suspects, work relating to the crimes of the empire. Writing their names, it seemed to us to see their heads fall one after the other under the axe of the executioner. Giving ourselves to this act of reparation, we wished to avenge the memories of the dead. The time had come where, without motive, without explanation, without judgment, they would be thrown in cells of the state and transported to Cayenne or to Africa. Antonin Dubost, 1868. The financiers to whom Napoleon III had delivered Mexico hoped for another war of conquest, a new prey to devour. The war gave a the war gave a coup de grâce to the empire. There were training of men like the training of a pack of dogs in the times of hunts, but the sounds of the copper instruments, the promises of the preachers, did not awaken the masses. So the empire sang the Marseillaise. The masses rose up. Unconsciously they sang, believing that with the Marseillaise they would have liberty. Paid informants and imbeciles would yell, "To Berlin! To Berlin!" "To Berlin," repeated the naive, imagining they would get there by singing the German Rhine. But this time it didn't hold up in our glass, and it was our blood in which the hooves of the horses marked their prints. The financiers came onto stage. One of them, Jecker, was the most famous. Rochefort speaks thus of him in The Adventures of My Life. We knew, maybe we no longer remember, that this crooked financier, like the rest of them, had lent at a rate of interest 300 or 400 times higher than the usual rate of usury, 15,000 francs to the government of the General Miramont, who had in exchange recognized 5 million francs of debt. When the new president of the Mexican Republic, Juarez, arrived in power, he naturally refused to pay the bill which had been so shamelessly extorted. Jecker, armed with 75 million on paper, went to find Morny, to whom he promised 30% of the commission if he persuaded the emperor to demand from Juarez the execution of the treaty passed with Miramont. In 1870, charged with inspecting the papers found at the Tuileries, left empty by the escape of the empress and her servants, most of whom had sworn to die for her, I found the material proof of the complicity of Morny in exchange for a promise made by Jecker to give him 22 million francs, engaged us in a liberticidal war, a war which cost us more than 1 billion francs and paved the way to Sedan. This Jecker, who was Swiss, had overnight received letters of French naturalization, and his demands had been his main demands had been presented to the intrepid Juarez. The affair was for the rest more or less exactly repeated under the colors of the Tunisian expedition. Henri Rochefort, Adventures of My Life. An American-style duel between the journalist Odis Barrault and the financier Jecker, a little time after the war with Mexico, made much noise. Barrault, considered dead, having received a bullet in the chest, found himself better all of a sudden, and finally fully recovered, to proclaim that the enemies of the empire had a hard life. We've seen since financial endeavors even more monstrous than those of that time, facing the flow in favor of war. There were demonstrations for peace, composed of students, internationalists, of revolutionaries. The following verses were written on a night after a demonstration. Gives an idea. Demonstrations of peace. It is evening. We go walking in long lines along the boulevards, saying peace, peace. In the shadow, we are stalked by servile packs of dogs. O liberty, will your day never come? And the pavement stomped by heavy canes, resonating deafeningly. The bandit wants to last, to refresh with blood his laurel who is fading. He needs combats, even if France sinks. Cursed, from your palace do you feel these humans passing by? It is your end. Do you see them in your nightmares, going through Paris, same as phantoms? Can you hear, in Paris whose blood you will drink? And the march chanted with a strange rhythm, across the demonstration like a large herd passes, and Caesar brandishes 100 times over his phalanx, and to strike France he polishes his blade. Since combat is needed, since they want war, peoples frowned sadder than death. It is together and against the tyrants that we must wage it. Bonaparte and William will have the same destiny. Louise Michel, 1870. Rochefort, having written in the Marseillaise that the road to Berlin would not be a simple military stroll, the presses of his journal were broken by those agents whom people called the White Vests, and who encouraged the unconscious with them. Nevertheless, the cry, "Peace, peace," sometimes covered those of the imperial gangs of "To Berlin, to Berlin." Paris, more and more, was detaching itself from Bonaparte. The eagle had led in its wings. The revolution called all those who were young, ardent, and intelligent. Oh, how at that time the Republic was beautiful. The lantern of Rochefort wandering through the throat cutters was shining light into the depths. On all this was passing in the air the voice of Aaron from the châtiment. Sound the knell, bumblebee, sound today the knell, bumblebee of Notre Dame. Sound today the knell, and tomorrow the tocsin. Victor Hugo. Malon traced the last moments of the empire in a picture of great realism. Then, he said, the straitjacket in which humanity suffocated was cracking on all parts. An unknown shiver is agitating the two worlds. The Indian people are revolting against the English capitalists. North America fight and triumph for the liberation of blacks. Ireland and Hungary are in agitation. Poland has risen. Liberal opinion in Russia imposes the commencement of liberation of the slave peasants, while the Russian youth is made enthusiastic by the accents of Chernyshevsky, Herzen, and Bakunin, make themselves propagandists of the social revolution. Germany, who was agitated by Karl Marx, Lassalle, Boker, Babel, Leibniz, enters the social movement. English worker, English workers conserving the memory of Ernest Jones and Owen are, are full of movements of association. In Belgium, in Switzerland, in Italy, in Spain, workers are realizing that their politicians have deceived them and seek way to ameliorate their destiny. French workers are leaving the lethargy in which they had been plunged by June and December. On all parts, the movements are accentuating, the proletarians are uniting to help in the demands of their aspirations, still vague but ardent. Jean-Baptiste Malon, Third Defeat of the Proletariat. All intelligent men fought against war. Michelet wrote to a French journalist the following letter for publishment. Dear friend, no one wants war. We will make Europe believe we want it. This is a coup of surprise scheming. Millions of peasants voted blindly yesterday. Why? They thought to avoid tumult that scared them. Did they think they were voting for war? The death of their children? It is horrible to abuse this unthought out vote. But the summum of the shame, the death of morality, would be that France let it happen. Against all her feelings, against all her interests. Let us have a plebiscite, and this one seriously. Let us consult the ease of the richest to the poorest class, the urbans to the peasants. Let us consult the nation. Let us take those who earlier made this majority forgetful of its promises. To each one we said yes, but most of all, no war. They do not remember, but France remembers. She will sign with us an address of fraternity to all Europe, of respect for Spanish independence. Let us plant the flag of peoples. War only to those who would wish war on this world. Michelet, July 10th, 1870. The great historian could not ignore that those who possess force do not have the custom of surrendering to reason. Force employed in service of justice against Napoleon III and Bismarck alone could have stopped their conspiracy against so many human lives thrown in pasture to the crows. The 15th of July, war was declared. The Maréchal Leboeuf announced the next day that nothing was missing to the army, not even a single button.